Governments around the world are quietly making hundreds of millions of dollars from this, while at the exact same time publicly blaming it for the housing crisis. And once you see this, it's really hard to unsee. Because Airbnb isn't just some disruptive tech platform anymore. It's become a tax machine. Every time someone books a short-term rental, that stay is taxed almost exactly like a hotel. In British Columbia, you're paying GST, PST, and the municipal and regional district tax. That's roughly 15 to 16% on every booking. So every time someone stays in an Airbnb, the government is taking a cut. And when you zoom out, that starts to add up fast. Across BC, short-term rentals are generating anywhere from between $150 to $250 million per year in tax revenue. In Vancouver alone, you're looking at roughly $30 million to $60 million annually. Now, think about that for a second. This is a meaningful recurring revenue stream. And yet, if you listen to the public conversation about it, you would think that Airbnb is nothing but a problem. So, which is it? Is Airbnb a major problem or a major source of tax revenue? Because right now, governments are trying to have it both ways. They collect the tax revenue and then turn around and blame the platform. Now, before we go any further, I break down topics that affect our market here in Vancouver. So if you want to stay up to date on that stuff, make sure you hit that subscribe button below. Now, this is where the conversation usually gets oversimplified because the idea sounds intuitive. If you reduce Airbnb, more units go back to the long-term market and rents go down. But when you actually look at what's happened in major cities all over the world that have tried this, that was never the outcome. Cities like Berlin brought in some of the strictest restrictions in the world. Barcelona has cracked down aggressively for years. San Francisco implemented heavy regulation and enforcement. And Toronto and Vancouver introduced the principal residence rule. And yet, across all of these places, rents didn't suddenly drop. They actually kept rising. Even in New York, which I covered in a previous video, where Airbnb listings collapsed after new regulations, rents still hit record highs. Now, that doesn't mean Airbnb has zero impact, but it does show us something very important, and it's that Airbnb just isn't one of the main drivers. Housing prices are being pushed by much bigger forces. Population growth, limited supply, construction constraints, and interest rates. Airbnb exists inside that system. It doesn't control it. And at the same time, it's generating significant tax revenue for governments. In Greece, for example, Airbnb and short-term rental taxes just generated over 1 billion euros in a single year. Which brings us back to Vancouver. Because this summer, Vancouver is about to host one of the biggest global events on the planet, the FIFA World Cup. And events like this put a city's accommodation system under massive pressure. Tens of thousands of people arrive at once and demand spikes. When that happens, prices move fast. Hotels don't just get more expensive, they surge. We're already seeing listings during peak World Cup dates in Vancouver sitting at around $600 to over $1,000 a night. Which is not unusual. That's exactly how major events work. Hotels use dynamic pricing. When demand spikes, they raise prices accordingly. Now, think about who that really impacts though. It's not the high-end international travelers. They're still gonna come. It's regular Canadians. People from Alberta, people from smaller cities, families who want to participate in a once-in-a-lifetime event happening in their own country. Suddenly, that trip becomes a lot harder to justify. And this is where Airbnb becomes really important because it does something that hotels can't. It allows supply to expand. Hotels are fixed, there's only a certain number of rooms. But allowing homeowners to do short-term rentals allows thousands of additional units to come onto the market temporarily right when demand is at its highest. But here's the problem. Vancouver has heavily restricted Airbnb. Under the current rules, you can only rent out your principal residence, which means that you can only rent it out for 6 months out of the year, because for it to qualify as your principal residence, it means that you have to be living there for at least 6 months out of the year. There are licensing requirements and a useless new registration system. There's also enforcement. Hosts get audited all the time. There are limits on how properties can be used, and licensing fees from the city have 10x'd in the last couple years. So at the exact moment the city needs more accommodation supply, it has legally capped the only way it can possibly expand it. And that has real consequences. Fewer options, higher prices, less accessibility. It also means that homeowners and renters miss out on what could be a once-in-a-decade opportunity. Yes, I said renters, because tenants can Airbnb too, as long as they have permission from their landlord and the building allows for it. Now, here's where things get even more interesting, because if Airbnb is generating hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenue every single year, and could be generating even more if it wasn't so heavily restricted, then why isn't any of that money being used to actually solve the housing problem? Think about how housing gets built in Vancouver. Developers are already dealing with some of the highest development costs in the country. Land is expensive, construction costs are high, and interest rates have gone up. On top of that, the city charges massive fees for new housing. And I already went over this in a separate video, but the city is actively trying to increase those developer fees by an absurd amount, which makes it even harder to build new rental supply. So on one hand, we're saying we need more housing, and on the other hand, we're making it more expensive to build new housing. Now, imagine a different approach. Instead of increasing those fees, what if the city used the tax revenue from short-term rentals to offset that? You take that $250 million coming in across BC, which again would be more if we didn't restrict it so heavily, and you start directing a portion of that to reduce the cost of building rental housing. Use that money to help cover some of the developer fees. Lower fees, more viable projects, more rental units actually getting built. Because right now, a lot of projects don't fail because there's no demand. They fail because the math doesn't add up. So if you can lower costs even slightly for the people that are actually building these homes, you unlock supply that otherwise never gets built, which in turn lowers rents. And that's the part that just doesn't get talked about a lot. Short-term rentals aren't just generating revenue. They're generating revenue that could directly be used to increase the housing supply. Instead, we're doing the opposite, which puts even more pressure on the system. Now, here's where I want to be very clear about my position. I'm definitely pro Airbnb, but not in the way that most people often assume. I'm not arguing for no rules at all. I'm arguing for reasonable flexibility. If you own your home, you should have the ability to choose how you use it. If you want to rent it out long term, that's your choice. If you want to rent it out short term for a week during a major event, that should also be your choice. Because at the end of the day, that's your property. And that idea matters. Because we're talking about people's homes, their largest financial asset for most of them, something that they've worked years to afford. And we're increasingly telling these people exactly how they are and are not allowed to use it. Now, here's another point that often gets missed. Even if you loosen restrictions on Airbnb, not every homeowner suddenly becomes a short-term rental host right away. In fact, most of them don't, because short-term rentals come with trade-offs of their own. More work, more turnover, and more uncertainty. A lot of people prefer stable tenants, predictable income, and less hassle. So this idea that loosening restrictions would suddenly pull massive amounts of housing out of the long-term market, it doesn't really add up with how people actually behave. What you'd likely end up with is a mix. Some people stay long-term, some people experiment with short-term, some people switch it up between long-term and short-term depending on the year and the season. But overall, the system doesn't collapse. What it does do is create flexibility. And that flexibility becomes incredibly valuable during peak demand events like the FIFA World Cup. Without it, you're left relying almost entirely on hotels. And hotels will charge whatever the market allows them. The reality is that this isn't a simple issue. But the data from major cities around the world is becoming harder and harder to ignore. Cracking down on Airbnb hasn't solved housing, but it has reduced flexibility for homeowners, supply during peak demand, and opportunities for hardworking Canadians. And as Vancouver heads into one of the biggest global events it will host in decades, those trade-offs are about to become very visible. Because when people start looking for places to stay and realize that their options are limited and prices are out of reach, that's when this conversation stops being theoretical and becomes very real. If you're curious what Airbnb looks like from an ownership perspective, or you're curious as to how these rules affect your specific situation, there's a Calendly link below. I'd be happy to go over it with you.